Hello and welcome to Vimbue.com, a smart way to learn anything you want to learn. Today in this session we are going to learn how to create a secondary index on the database table in SAP. So to create a secondary index we need to get into ABAP dictionary. So we'll enter SC11, select the radio button database table and enter the name of the table on which you want to create a secondary index. Press change. There you are in the table. Now before I do anything over here, I want to talk a little bit about indexes. I want to make sure that everybody understand what actually indexes are, and then we'll talk a little bit about the primary index and then what secondary index is, and then we'll see how a secondary index is created. So when you create a table, what happens is here we are just defining it in our dictionary, but in the database there is exact copy of this table which is created. And it is not just that table that gets created, it is the copy of that table is also created, and that copy is known as the index, which defines the sorting of the data into it. Now when you define a table as you have defined in your dictionary, we can see that we have two fields. Okay, so we have a field called number, which is a key field, and we have another field called zcomp name, which is not a key field. So defining a key field, what we really mean is that this particular z number field is going to act as a unique identifier for my record. So when I say unique identifier, that means that my table will not have a record with the same number of z number field. Now, having said that, this is not a sorting. This is not the way data is going to store, data is going to pile in the table. It is just the way data is going to be identified. So I have not defined any way in which the data would be sorted into the table. Now that is something that system do it on its own, and that particular way of sorting the data is known as indexes. Now primary index is something which is created on its own. System creates it by default, and what that is, it is a combination of the key fields plus some of the other fields which are non-key fields, plus one additional column which is a pointer to the real position of the table. So ultimately what is happening is that when the system creates an index, it is creating a copy of the same table with the lesser number of columns, which includes all the key fields plus some of the additional fields plus a field which is actually an identifier or a pointer to the real position of the record into the database table itself. So what that helps, why to create two records, why to create two tables? Basically, indexing helps in the situation in which you have many number of columns. So if we have a table which has around 100 columns and then we have a huge number of data, the data needs to get sorted somehow. Data needs to get saved with some sorting, and that sorting is defined by a combination of all key fields plus some of the non-key fields which the system thinks would be important in this table, and that's all system generated. We don't do it. And then another field would be there as an additional field, and that would be a pointer to the real position. So if you have a table, that table might have a few records, and that might have a record at 10 position, and in your index, in your primary index, you might have that record as the first record. So basically your index is nothing but a copy of the existing table with a lesser number of columns plus an additional column which will have a pointer, which will have a position holder for the real position of that record in the database. So if you have a record in actually a table on 10th number, so the primary index will hold it as first position, but the pointer field of that particular record in your primary index will have a value as 10 to show that this is a 10th record in the database table. Now what actually that helps is this helps you to fetch the data faster. Now if you don't have any index, then the system will fetch it on the basis of the primary key. So this will actually make it more complex, make it more tough for database to get you the data if the data is in a huge number. If you don't have that many columns, then it would work. But anyways, the primary index is there. It is always there. So now, having said that, what primary index is, you know that there is a copy inside the database table, inside the database of the same table with a lesser number of fields which system has identified on its own to give you a possibly best sorting, so that your whole select query and your whole selection is optimized. But in some scenario, even that might not help. So if you have if you have a table which has 100 number of columns, and then you have a huge number of data and you use it very frequently, then you might not have that particular primary key useful enough for you. It still might take time. So what you will do is you will create a secondary index, which is again going to be a copy of the same table with the key fields plus the lesser number of fields again, but those fields would be of your choice, and then another field of as a pointer to point to the real position of the record. So then if you do that and you create a secondary index, what actually happens is there is again a copy of the same table, database table, with just 20 columns of your choice, and the sorting would be done on the basis of those 20 columns. So now if you put a select query on the table using the secondary index, you will get a record even faster, but on the basis of those fields that you have. So generally when we make a secondary index, we have those fields that we are going to use in our where condition normally in our program. And also, before making any secondary index, keep in mind that you only make secondary index to the field that are huge that have huge number of data, that have a huge number of columns, and that is going to be used very frequently. You don't put a secondary index to a table which is not going to be used very frequently, because then you don't really bother about the performance. You don't make secondary index to the tables which doesn't have many columns. For now, we will take an example of the existing table in which we have just 2 columns. So that's not an issue. It is just to show you how you create a secondary index. So as you can see, you have these 3 columns, these 3 buttons. We'll choose index, and we'll choose the create button, as you can see over here. So creating of a secondary index is fairly simple. You just have to select the create button, name it whatever you want. You can leave the default name as it is, or if you want, you can change it. Let's change it. Okay, let's leave it as it is, and then say save. You are there in the index creation. Name your index. I'll say test again, as I normally do. Then you have these unique radio buttons to identify that if you want your index to be dependent on some sort of database, you can even define that. But generally you leave it as it is. You leave it as non-unique index, and you leave it as index on all database. You don't care about what sort of database is underlying. Then you enter the fields. So if you put a help, you will get all the fields that you have. Now is the time to select the number of fields that you want to be used as an index and to be used in the sorting of the data. So you can choose as many fields. I'm choosing the one which is not there as the key field. It is just an example that I want to give. So I'll just say save, and then I'll activate it. Once I activate, my secondary index is there ready for me to be used. You activate it. You can come back after activation and then check if it is running fine for you. Generally this doesn't throw any sort of error because all you're doing is you're just putting the fields that you want. So now you're ready with your secondary index. You can come back and see if that is working for you. So you have a secondary index over here which was not there earlier. The name of the secondary index is NAM. So you can now use this NAM secondary index anywhere in any of the program and put a select query. Now there is one more thing which you have to keep in mind using these sort of secondary indexes, and that is if the way you were putting select query earlier on these